We're going on a decade of just the most change I think humans have ever been through.
What should have been seen as a societal crisis was seen as a business opportunity.
This episode is about AI as it relates to our psychology.
Everyone falls in love with AI.
Our sense of secure attachment.
So they are optimised for people to want to come back.
And our ability ultimately to have a shared sense of reality.
I believe that people crave that connection. That's why they're being drawn to Claude and those AI tools.
If you are no longer engaging in critical thinking, and that is going to literally change our brains.
We shouldn't be underselling the impact of AI, but I similarly want us to not undersell the capacities of what it means to be human.
We are alive to this. Roundtable conversations about what it means to be human in the age of AI. I'm so glad to have you all here today to have this conversation. In most of human history, tools were outside of us. We picked them up, we put them down. But this technology is very quickly living inside of us in many different ways. And so I want to explore that today. So to introduce the three of you, Joel Pearson, a Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience and Psychology at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. Joel is the founder of the Future Minds Lab and author of the Intuition Toolkit. Joel's work looks at how the mind makes decisions and adapts as technology reshapes it, what that means for us as individuals and what that means for us as a collective. Maia Gould is an Associate Professor at the Australian National University School of Cybernetics, where she works on how we understand, how we govern and how we live well with AI as it gets woven into the systems around us. And Monty Badami is an anthropologist and founder of the social enterprise Habitus. Monty's work centres on how we make meaning and stay connected to one another through relationships, through ritual, belief and connection. Before we dive in, I asked each of you to bring an item that means something to you. I'd love for you to share what you've brought and why you brought it today. Monty, we might start with you.
Okay, so I've brought this stone wrapped in a handmade twine. It's important to me because it reminds me of the moment where I decided to leave behind psychology. I was a third-year psychology student to embrace the perspectives of anthropology. It was a major worldview shift in me and a professional shift for me, and it inspired me to go back to where I found it, which was in South India in a place called Wayanad, and to do my field work with an Indigenous community to understand how they make sense of themselves in the context of complexity, chaos, marginalisation, dispossession, and essentially a pretty hard life. I could go on, but well, I was actually a diagnostic research assistant for the National Institute of Mental Health and Neurological Sciences in India, and we were doing some mental health camps with Indigenous communities, particularly with communities who are extremely marginalised. And at the time, the organisation would go in for a day and spend about half an hour with them and diagnose them and give them all these, give them enough medication to last for about 2 weeks and then bugger off and be on their way. And I was challenged by this because what I saw was not even treating the symptoms as such, but a medicalisation of what I thought was a deeply social, economic and political problem, which was social exclusion and marginalisation. And when I spoke with these people at the time, I didn't know the language yet. They said to me things like, we love Western medicine because they have to align themselves with modern identities. But they said, but we have another way of understanding this and another way of working with it, and that's through spirit possession. And so that's when my mind was blown, and was speaking with one of the chiefs who, somehow knew it was in my pocket, pulled it from my pocket and said, hey, listen, this stone is kind of a part of us. It's a part of our land, and you can't take it without taking the secrets that are embedded within it, but you're not ready yet. And so he tied it up with the twine and said, when the twine unravels, the secrets will be revealed. Now, I'm a scientist. I'm an atheist. I do not understand how that happened. I don't have an explanation, but I don't feel like I need one because it was incredibly meaningful. And needless to say, I left psychology. My parents were really upset because I was in third year psychology. I left psychology and committed to a life of anthropology, came back 10 years later to do my PhD research, where I was able to understand their symbols, their stories, their practices, and look at how self is held in relation to landscape. This is where I might challenge the idea of the interior and the exterior, or the idea that tools are necessarily external to us, because what I learnt was the relationship with cognitive ecologies, with our environment, with story, with relationship, with ancestry, with a whole range of things. It reminds us the technology of culture is pervasive and transcends those boundaries of inner and outer self. And it reminds us that humans have been engaged in more than human interactions and other human, non-human interactions as a way of making sense of complexity and understanding the conditions within which we live.
Is the twine unwound, or is it still not yet?
Yeah, it untied at a very particular moment in my life. It was one of those catalyst moments.
Joel, what did you bring to the table?
Well, I brought a skanky old hat. And it's been with me for, let's say, 15 years maybe. And yeah, it's just a hat. It's just, fabric and plastic and stuff. I picked this, and it has meaning because of the black sheep idea, to remind me, sort of be a visual reminder of that I don't need to fit in, that I can be sort of doing something in one area where I don't fit in, and that's okay. It's it's a way to feel almost proud of being a black sheep, but not quite proud, but just a reminder that it's okay when you don't fit in, and that can be a good thing. Yeah, and I think I bought a new one since then, exact same, but a newer one. But I kind of just like this old one, even though it's I don't normally wear it in public now because it's too old and sweat stained. So yeah, we'll keep that down on the floor so people don't need to get too close to it. But yeah.
Maya, what did you bring?
So I brought this little box. I don't know its origin story. I don't know where it came from originally, but it was given to me by my dad, my parents. So I have a heap of these little trinkety things. And my dad was a great curator of beautiful things, beautiful objects. And it was, the 60s, 70s and 80s, and you could find those beautiful curated little things with little backstories. And I was reflecting on how I've kept this with me, and I've carried it everywhere that I've lived, and everywhere I unpack and I put all my little things out. And they just remind me of the people who gave them to me. I frequently, will take a photo of something in my room and text it to someone and say, I'm just remembering you because I'm looking at this thing that you gave me. It's really interesting the way everything is so kind of mass-produced now, and we've got, access to amazing things. I remember being in Target. I have 2 little boys, so I never got to have little girls and dress little girls, but I was in Target and I saw this jumper, and it was a magic rainbow unicorn jumper with like a rainbow mane down the sleeve. And I was like, oh my God, you can get a unicorn jumper now. Like out of control. But there were dozens of them. And I'm sure if I went online, I could find 200 more versions of this item. And every item for me has this kind of backstory. When I look at it, I think about where it was made, what are the raw materials, what does it do in the world? So there's this sort of these embedded stories in objects. And there's sort of a grief now, I feel, in this kind of mass-produced kind of saccharine, access to things. You can have whatever you desire. And I feel like that's a really, really interesting analogy with what we're seeing with AI and with large language models, this access to human technology, human thought. But in what way does it kind of cheapen it? In what way does it kind of make it have less embedded meaning for us when it's so distributed? So they're the kind of things that I'm thinking about all the time. And
let's stay with that train of thought, Maya, because as Monty mentioned before, the proposition really of this conversation is that that AI, these models that we're using, they're not just tools, that they are almost like environments that learn who we are and in many ways shape who we become. I'd love to hear each of you respond to that. Is that accurate? Is that overblown? Where do you sit when you hear that phrase? Maybe May, we'll start with you.
This AI moment is really, really interesting and important. I think the natural language processing and the large language models is something different, because language is the way that we connect with one another. It's the way that we make meaning. It's the way that we instruct one another. It's the way that we reading poetry, it moves us. It's, we send letters, we write diaries. It's so deeply human. And when you have a tool that can mimic that, then I think you're in uncharted psychological territory. I really do think that that's the case. And I often talk about, everyone falls in love with AI. If you let it, you will, because it embeds this human meaning and human language in it. And I think what I keep trying to say to people is, this is not the power of the compute. This is the power of language. And so how do we separate this idea of the Terminator or, some kind of AI technology, very metal and steel, from the beautiful, very human language? And how can we stay in love with language but manage the technology?
We're being too conservative. I think it's going to be a much bigger thing than people are predicting. In other words, the hype is way too small for what it is. Right? And you mentioned other technology revolutions, and still the media and lots of people will refer to it as just a new technology, another tech revolution. But it's intelligence, and there's the language part of it. There's the world models now. There's the X, Y, and Z models. There's all these other kinds of models which are emerging and not really publicly available yet. And I think it's intelligence. And so to think of it as a technology is like a categorical error. And when you think about it like that, and you make that mistake, you massively underpredict everything that's coming. And intelligence is something our society is built on. Most of our relationships are built on, and everything in our society is built on the way we work, what we do. And so when you start disrupting that, or you just sort of make that ubiquitous and very low cost, it's going to disrupt everything in our society and everything that our lives are built around in ways that are going to be very uncomfortable, very exciting, very beneficial, but it's going to disrupt most of what we know. And so I think that, it's massively underselling it to talk about it just as a language model now, or as a tool, or as another tech revolution like the internet or the phone or the printing press. It is something completely different, and there's no precedent for this or no way to map it or understand it. And people in leadership roles in governments, I don't think they've really grasped this. And then the other layer on top of that is just how quickly it's advancing, that it really is at minimal exponential, probably hyper exponential now. And humans don't get the exponential change. We don't understand it. We think in linear terms. And so this time next year, things are going to be very different again, and people just don't predict that. So for those reasons and other reasons, I think, we're massively under-predicting the impact that's going to have to our lives and our kids' lives.
Look, I think there's so much to say, right? I think I love the fact that you asked us to bring in objects. As an anthropologist, I'm fascinated by artifacts of material culture and how we imbibe them with meaning, with story, with memory. And this is specifically what the stone represents to me. But it's a fallacy to assume that these things don't also come pre-configured with meaning, just as the environment is, right? And so when we talk about language models, I agree, I think we shouldn't be underselling the impact of AI, but I similarly want us to not undersell the capacities of what it means to be human. When I think about, the major disruptions throughout evolutionary time, I think, well, what are the lessons we can draw from other times and other places in making sense of these disruptions? I would argue that it is a cultural assumption to suggest that we all think in a linear way. When we can start to challenge the epistemic injustice of a particular language dominating the narrative, and actually connect with other ways of knowing and being in the world. For me, I think as an anthropologist, I'll say that all the time. It's my kind of my excuse. But I think this is the stuff we need to really start to explore, because the way that we interact with the environment, the world, I agree. I think that AI is more than just a tool. It is a tool, and it's more than a tool, much like the environment is. I don't hold to like a Cartesian way of dealing with it, that it is somehow a cognitive thing that a cognitive problem that we need to resolve. I see our interaction with the world, with culture, with the environment, with AI as a deeply embodied thing. And so we need to start exploring different ways of understanding the issue.
Jo, let's go back to you with that invitation from Monty. I mean, you've spent years thinking about how our minds work, the way that our minds shape and adapt. However, we are not particularly good at coming to terms with the level of change that we need to adapt to at the moment. So I'd love to hear how you're thinking about that in this very brave new era that we are stepping into.
The 2 points, the pillars I always come back to are change and uncertainty. And they're the things that I think summarize the 2 pointy bits of where, I guess, people are starting to hurt now and where people are struggling. Yes, in terms of, humans, there's an illusion called the end of history illusion. And when you can get data, there's data on this showing that when you ask someone, at any point in time, they think like, this is me, this is Joel, I'm good now, I'm pretty much set. I'll be the same for the rest of my life. Even when people admit how much they changed in the decade before, they fail to predict how much they're going to personally change.
In the future.
If we all feel like stable, this is who I am, So we get that sort of level of change wrong. And the way I sort of view change is from the sort of, it sounds very corporate, but change management point of view. So from decades and decades of research with companies, when they're going to go through a simple change, maybe, think of Netflix, they've finished lots of big changes. Rather than posting out DVDs, they're going to start streaming. And that's a change from A to B. It's a one-off change. They bring in change specialists that help everyone in the company to go through that change. They start by talking about why they're doing it, what's the purpose behind it, so that people don't feel it's just aimless change. And they'll try and bring people in to have a say in some of the change so they don't feel helpless in it. There's all kinds of things we know about and all these different frameworks for managing that change. And if you don't manage it, it's way less successful. I think the data is about 600% more likely to be successful, whatever that means in that context, when it's managed. And so when you sort of scale that up to the moment we're in now, and, let's just talk about Australia for now, we're going on a decade of just the most change I think, humans have ever been through. It seems obvious to me that you shouldn't just leave change to run free and leave people to be unmanaged. Not that they need sort of moment by moment management, but we need some frameworks. We know a lot about this. And so what would frameworks look like to help people through a decade of change? They can think about this, a family at home or a business indeed, or the whole country. That's kind of what we've been working on. What does a AI-specific change framework for the whole of Australia look like? And what could the government deliver on that human side? And from the government's been doing things around AI, but nothing on this human side to help sort of people, help them through this change. It's different from traditional change, from that one-off change, one that's just going to be change after change after change for the next decade. I think there's more emotions, there's way more uncertainty than typical change. And people also starting to feel helpless, because the change is kind of being thrust upon them. No one got a choice. No one voted for AI to change, the way work is done, to change education, to change the way their kids relate to them. None of these things we had any choice in, but it's kind of happening. So people are more vulnerable than usual. Now then there's the uncertainty piece as well that fits in here. And I'll sometimes say, you don't need to lose your job to feel the pain and fear of that already. And people are feeling it already, this uncertainty. And we know from a lot of neuroscience research that humans, all primates, all mammals pretty much really dislike uncertainty. It's like a fear stimulus. It's like a venomous snake, slithering over the table now. So simply not knowing the future puts us into this sort of anxiety, fight or flight state. And that's where a lot of people are in at the moment. And I'll sometimes refer to it as a pandemic of uncertainty that's spreading. And I see it, amongst people, employees, if you like, definitely amongst students everywhere I go. Students are worried, whether they're in, high school or at university or studying something else. They're just worried about the future, whether they should even think about going to university. Are there going to be jobs? Can they use AI to cheat or not? Is it cheating? I want to use AI because I'm going to need it for a job. So why is the university banning it from me using it? And there's just so much uncertainty. So we know that already uncertainty is causing mental health challenges. Quality of life is going down at the moment. And so I think they're the two sort of ways of summarizing this moment. And it's been really interesting just in the last few months. We've seen first in the US and now here in Australia, the protests happening around data centers are really interesting. And I think yes, there's the physical stuff, the environmental things and the noise and the pollution and things, but it's also the first time people have had a physical thing to congregate around and to, have something in front of them they can voice and release some of this stress and angst around the AI. And it's been amazing to see that that's sort of this way of venting some of that. Because you can't go, no one in Australia is going to fly to OpenAI's headquarters and protest. Some people might in the US. So we're starting to see some of that happen around these points of gathering.
So I'm going to bring Monty and Maia in a moment, and this will go to an embodied relational perspective, but also Maia's going to really talk us through what the tech's actually doing. But just to stay with our minds, our brains, what happens to a mind when it's increasingly spending its time inside of a machine that is predicting what it wants before we know what we want ourselves?
Well, there's two things happening now that we know about, and one is like just the handing over decisions and thinking to AI systems. And if you don't use it, you lose it. This idea that that our brains are quite plastic; they're changing all the time. Each day, our brains are a little bit different from the day before. And so, if you are no longer engaging in critical thinking and no longer first principles thinking, you are just handing it over to somebody else, or a human or an AI. That is going to literally change our brains.
Can you just tell me what is first principles thinking?
Oh, just like this idea of, young people who are now AI natives. And there's now data that if you ask them a question and the answer's not obvious, they won't sit there and think about it. Like, okay. Oh, what should I do? What is that? Is that good or bad? What are all the ingredients that go into that decision? Their immediate instinct instantly is to turn to AI and start talking to AI about it. And so they're missing that opportunity to think deeply, to think critically, to use their brain. And I'll sometimes use the analogy of, going to a gym and working out, but instead of lifting the muscles myself, I'm using a robotic exoskeleton that's doing all the heavy lifting for me. And so I could go into the gym and work out all day, every day, but my muscles aren't getting a workout. So they are going to atrophy. And so it's the same for our brains. And the example lots of people like to give is the GPS. So navigation maps, we used to either, if we had to, use a paper map, or we would just remember how to get to places and how to drive around. Then digital GPS systems came in and we stopped doing that. And some people would argue that's bad for our brains. So our brains, our navigation systems in our brains would have absolutely changed, would have rewired in different ways. So is that good or bad? Some people have argued that's good because, in the meantime, you're learning and listening to podcasts and your brain's, coming up with new ideas. Now, when it comes to just outsourcing thinking and decision-making and understanding, it's very hard to see the upside there. And so there's this pressure, from the very top all the way through, whether it's people in leadership roles, employees or students, to use AI as much as possible just to stay competitive. And so there's this weird pressure where they need to outsource their thinking to it because it's going to speed things up. They can do more, get ahead. But at the same time, we're shrinking our brains, basically. So this AI brain rot idea has come up. And there's now talk of, the first generation of young people who will have a lower IQ than any generation before, which has never happened since we've measured these things. And the other newer thing is something called AI brain fry, which is just more this idea of trying to overly multitask, even though multitasking it's not really how the brain works, but people are now having to monitor, like 4 or 5 AI agents at work and 2 other platforms, plus everything else they normally do. And our brains can't really monitor more or hold in working memory more than 3 or 4 items. There's lots of research on that when it comes to memory or just tracking, lots of things moving around. And so we're hitting this capacity limit of our brains, and it's causing people to have these headaches and be absolutely exhausted in the afternoon. So that's another aspect of this. And there is data that you can improve these skills. You can speed up the processing and be able to do a bit more. But that's another thing that's happening. So those 2 points, I think, in terms of the brain are important. Then there's the young people, what is the latest data? 50% of teens in America using some form of AI companion. And so we're likely to see a generation of young people with a completely different idea of what relationships even are, right? This very smooth, frictionless, and you add that to a decade of emotional intelligence that has been declining. You add on this on top, and that's another challenge that yes, some people would say it's curing loneliness, but loneliness you can also argue is a good thing for various reasons for humans.
We're going to get into all of that juicy territory. Mont, arguably every era of humanity has had to deal with the adaptation to and consequences of tooling, right? Like we've adapted, we've created new tools, we've evolved our tools over the years, and they have become part of our lives. Is this a difference of degree, or is this a totally different category of the way we can think about the tools we're using, the technology that we're welcoming into our psychological lives?
Definitely think it's a difference of degree. I can't answer the question about the difference of category. It's still early days, right? Like what I do know is Herbert Marcuse said, that we can't have the great revolutions of Marx like we used to because we don't have that very clear difference between, the proletariat and the ruling class. And ultimately, we are so invested in the items of capital that exist in our world, the things that we consume, the identities that we signal through being very much embedded and webbed into this kind of economic system. And he said that the only way for there to be a major change is not through a great revolution, but through a great rethinking, if you will, or a connection back to culture. And he suggested that the way to do that was to bring in these different voices that are not part of the status quo, that are not elevated because of privilege or power, that are not actually writing the dominant narratives of society. And this is why I come back to my little stone, right? Because just as we have cognitively offloaded meaning into our artefacts of material culture, what I've had the privilege of learning through working with Indigenous communities is the way that we create cognitive ecologies of meaning through our interactions with things. Think of the Indigenous songlines, for example, and how we have these spatial mnemonics of meaning. And the work that I did with the Paniya in South India was more than just an understanding of mental health and suicide and, the application of conditional aid through development programs. It was also about how memory works, how humans use our embodied connection to the world to process, store and recall vast amounts of information. And I agree, Joel, that these things are atrophying, right? Because we're not encouraged to use them, but I don't believe that the capability is lost, because I know that there are currently many cultures, communities and people who are experiencing immense complexity, uncertainty and change every day. There are lessons here right now in the world that we live in that we can draw on if we can step outside of, I believe it's an epistemic bubble and a bit of a bubble of privilege around how we understand AI and its impact. If we can step out of that a little bit and connect with the people in the world who have wisdom to share with us around, this very human quality of being able to navigate complexity, change and uncertainty, whether it be through culture, whether it be through tools, whether it be through our environment. I think there are stories that we can be connecting with right here, right now, that are incredibly valuable. But this then brings it to a question of equity, inclusion, representation, power, privilege, which is something I'm kind of big on.
And to be able to do that, we need the presence of mind, right? We need to actually be able to see that there is a bubble in which to step out of. And what Joel's pointed to is that this mental atrophy that takes place, it's almost like a numbness, right? Like, is there a numbness that we actually need to discover or reflex those muscles in order to be able to see this from a wider vantage point?
There is a numbness. There is a loss of meaning. There is a sense of we've been trapped in a prison of our own exploitation, if you will, to quote Byung-Chul Han. We are at a moment where, we are asking some fundamental questions around what it means to be human.
And we're doing so at a time of a loneliness epidemic. We're doing so at a time of a mental health epidemic.
Absolutely. And let's think about the French existentialists after World War II, the Holocaust and the Great Depression, right? Like, that was pretty freaking hard and provided some incredibly challenging existential questions that enabled them to come together and not be caught up on the answers, but to really embrace the opportunity to connect and to explore meaning together, and that the co-construction of meaning in those spaces was incredibly meaningful. That's this wonderful human quality. And I talk about my business doing well because I believe that there are people who feel challenged and numb and lost and uncertain, and what they're coming to us to help them with is to actually support them to develop the human skills to sit with uncertainty, to navigate complexity when things are not predictable, when they don't have all the answers, when they're not the expert, and to do so together. So that's where I see the real potential.
No, it's beautiful. Maia, I want to bring you in because a lot of the potential Monty's talking about, and a lot of the kind of the neurological phenomenon that's going on that Joel's painted the picture of, that's the orientation of us as consumers and us as relational complex beings making sense of this. But I'd love for you to talk us through the actual tech from a psychological perspective. How is it built? What is it doing? Explain to us how these models are so insidiously impacting the sort of psychological and relational components of our lives.
Yeah, sure. I want to come back to that loneliness epidemic that you were talking about just quickly first, just because I think, this is the context that all of this is landing in, and we can't separate that cultural context from the actual technology itself. Sherry Turkle had a great quote in a recent New York Times article. She said, what should have been seen as a societal crisis was seen as a business opportunity by Silicon Valley tech companies. And I think the first thing we'd say is that these tools are absolutely incredible, amazing things that they can do. And I also think that we've got some challenge thinking around how exactly they do work. So I think there's a real sense generally that these are things that can kind of grow organically, that they are, we can initiate like, fertilized egg and we grow our AI. And that's kind of what it feels like when you talk to it, because it feels like a human. It learns about you over time. So there's that real kind of, there's this analogy with biology. And really there is a kind of evolutionary process that has been happening, but it's product development evolution. So the large language models that we all interact with now, ChatGPT, etc., they all have at their heart a frontier model, which is a large language model, and it does operate as a statistical model. It's too much of a simplification to say it's just next word prediction, because it's a lot more sophisticated than that. But at its heart, it's a model that knows how to talk. It's ingested and been trained on all of the information on the net, and so it has learnt to talk. My colleague at the School of Cybernetics at ANU says it's kind of incredible. We've taught sand to talk, so referring to the silica chips that underpin it. But I think the key point here is that the language model from 2022, the ChatGPT that kind of hallucinated a lot and didn't often say the right thing and you could fool it really easily, is radically different to the products that we have now. So they have much bigger context windows, they can ingest more data, but there's a lot of engineering that goes around them as well. A lot of design choices. What they're optimised for at present, because they are made by big tech companies. Big tech companies have got a lot of investors who are expecting this to make money eventually, and so they are optimised for engagement. So they are optimised for people to want to come back to those models. And so the design choices that are made are things like, will people be more likely to come back if the chatbot uses I language? So that's not native in the language model. That is a design choice. Will they be more likely to come back if I give them a little bit of flattery at the start when they give me a prompt? That's a great question. And all of these things are shown, and through all of that testing, shown to bring people back. And we also have the rise now of something that's called human feedback reinforcement learning. This is kind of like the new Amazon Mechanical Turk. This is like people giving tools prompts and then thumbs up or thumbs downing the answers. And generally people really like it. when the tool is sycophantic, when it flatters them, when it calls them I, when it chooses a name for itself. So they thumbs up, and that gets fed straight into the design of those models. And that's really when we saw a huge sycophantic turn last year, which also coincided with a lot of these companies saying the rubber's got to hit the road and we have to increase engagement.
So considering the design reaches, what is the older human wiring that this is connecting to in each of us?
Yeah, it's really interesting. There's this movement at the moment which is talking about attachment hacking to do with AI. And that's like playing on this idea of like attention hacking, which was like the social media, infinite scroll, dopamine kind of stuff. The idea comes through from attachment theory, which is just what are the conditions for humans to form bonds with one another. And the idea is that attachment hacking is like hacking our oxytocin, our bonding system. And there are sort of three conditions. Is the thing that you're trying to bond with, is it responsive? Does it respond to you? Does it mirror you? Does it co-regulate with you? Is it supportive? So is it kind to you? Is it kind of predictable? So you know that if you go to this, the object that you're trying to bond to or the human that you're trying to bond to, will you kind of get the same? Is it going to be pretty similar every time you go? They're not angry sometimes and nice some other times. So we form these bonds based on these three principles, and we can form really strong bonds when those three principles are in place. They are also the metrics of engagement.
So when we hear a term like anthropomorphic AI, what that essentially means is AI, chatbots and companions that is designed to be anthropomorphic, to seem human, to simulate emotion, to simulate intimacy, personality, empathy. And they remember us, and they're designed to keep deepening the relationship. So attachment hacking is what happens when that design almost works too well, when an AI simulates emotional intimacy closely enough that the person feels like they are in a genuine and very deep relationship. But of course, there's no human on the other side of that. There is a product that is engineered to keep you engaged.
So I would say it's probably like this inadvertent kind of attachment hacking, if you like, that it's product choice driven by a desire for profit. But the result is that people are starting to form bonds with AI. Like there are as many stories as you could care to find, but we're really discovering, as Joel said, that, people are turning to AI, talking to it, talking in a very personal way, and they're getting that feedback back. That's really sort of encouraging this forming of bonds. And that's the challenge.
Yeah. And in reality, what that looks like is, maybe a teenager comes home from school and instead of telling their mother what happened in the playground, they sit and they talk to their companion. And they're, increasingly people are sharing with their chatbots and companions more and more of their own souls that perhaps they wouldn't actually share with the people around them. And it's the fastest uptake of a consumer technology in history, faster than smartphones, faster than social media. So this is quite extraordinary when you think about the scale of the problem. When we increasingly outsource core caregiving roles that would otherwise be the domains of our parents and our aunties and uncles and our teachers and perhaps even our therapists, we lose our sense of secure attachment with those caregivers, but we replace it with a sense of secure attachment with this machine that can simulate empathy, that can simulate a secure relationship with us. The harms we're starting to see aren't distraction or anxiety. They're much deeper. Emotional dependence, distorted thinking. And in vulnerable people, we're now seeing documenting cases of AI-induced psychosis and delusion. And there are clinicians that are really now sounding the alarm. There was actually an interview, it was a few years ago now, but it was an interview with one of the founders of Character AI. And he was asked, are you trying to replace Google? Is that the goal? And his response was, no, we're not trying to replace Google, we're trying to replace your mother. Which was very telling of exactly what you're talking about.
A moment of honesty.
Yeah, that's right.
Can I speak to that very quickly?
Please.
Now, the challenge, of course, is if we are only looking for the lived experience stories of the ideal customer who enables the efficient and effective productization of the technology, as opposed to actively seeking out people who aren't generally included in those stories. And I love that you're situating this within that deep economic imperative, because, we can't separate the adolescents turning to AI. I mean, my adolescent turns to her guitar, not necessarily to us all the time. So she's turning to a thing that isn't human. I'm not saying it's the same thing, but I don't think we can separate why the parent isn't actually available in the first place, as a result of the economy, the pressure to productivity, the pressure for career, the technologies that the parent themselves are wrapped up in as they're, interacting with their screens. I mean, I'd love to talk about Baudrillard.
That, I think that is actually the key.
How good, right?
Because this is what the technology is landing into. We're already experiencing this kind of separation. We're experiencing, kids that are growing up with their parents on devices. That's actually, it's all chicken and egg. So we actually need to retrain ourselves to connect with humans. It's one thing to sort of try and control the technology, and it's another thing to try and rebuild that muscle, I guess.
Jo, what happens to a brain when it spends so many hours every day with a companion that never tires of us? It never gets cranky. It never needs to take a break to go and have a coffee and come back to the argument a little later. Indeed, never argues with us. What is happening inside of us during this? We're
going to see a generation of young people who have the idea of friction in a human conversation is going to feel very scary and threatening, and they're just going to avoid it at all costs. They're going to think that when you talk to a person, they should be agreeing. That should be easy and smooth and fluid. And it will feel very foreign and uncomfortable. And we've already seen this happening, like I said before, for a decade. We've seen emotional intelligence going down, and that has been linked to tech use and social media use. And so we've seen that sort of channels of interaction already getting narrower and moving to, online discussions and then texting. And there's already a thing now where young people would prefer to text because they feel awkward talking in person or even just talking on the phone. So I think that this is just going to supercharge all of that movement, make us all feel, more alone and make human interaction more difficult and just reduce the overall human interaction, I think.
Monty, is a relationship with a machine, is it a real relationship or is it a rehearsal of one? What's going on for us relationally?
With a human always a real relationship, right? Like, are we often reproducing, dominant scripts in our interactions? I do it all the time. I told you as a neurodivergent person, I have, the reason why I'm an anthropologist is because I didn't understand humans. And so I spent a life trying to understand human interaction. And so I've got some really cool tools and frameworks and scripts that I draw on. And I also have opportunities where I can be completely open and honest and vulnerable and raw. Again, I think that we fall too easily into the false binaries and a reductive analysis of technology and AI and humans. And what I want for us is to embrace that complexity, to sit with the complexity and to start to see the opportunity that exists when we let go of the certainty around it. I know I haven't answered your question, Elle, but I'm good at that, right?
Well, this is where I want to go with you, Mon, because humans have always made meaning together. We've made meaning in relationship to each other, in ritual. What happens to that when more and more of our sense-making is augmented by this technology?
Yeah, and look, and even when we've made meaning by ourselves, we haven't made meaning by ourselves because the structures of language, the way that we interact is deeply informed by our sociability and our culture and the meaning that comes before us, right? I don't want to just make something up. I don't know the answer to that question, and I think that's okay. I think more of us need to be able to say that we don't know, right? What I do know is that I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I know that I use AI and I use more organic forms of self-reflection and conversation and human connection. I think this is where the issue is that we need to learn to work with it but not ignore some of those deeper social processes that are disconnecting us, explicitly disconnecting us. And this is where I think we are not all experiencing uncertainty and change in the same way, that the technology is explicitly being co-opted by people in positions of power. And you know, I'm in the army as well. I work in a range of spaces that are looking at the relationship between social division and national security, right? We are seeing people in positions of power not only use their power to dominate the political discourse, but dominate the media sources and to shape the social division that essentially keeps them in positions of power. And I think that technology, AI, social media, this is the risk. Well, this is a very big risk that I'm quite concerned with at the moment. How is that going unchecked? How and this is why I come back to the questions of inequality, power, privilege, the economic and the political relationships that underpin the technology. We can come up with all the change. I'm not saying this to minimise what you talk about. I love it. But we can come up with change management strategies. We can come up with ethical AI algorithms, but there is always going to be some powerful dude who just uses it for their own good and uses it at the expense of others. And disconnection, like the fact that we're blaming migrants for the housing crisis right now, is a perfect example of that. And this is a narrative that is reproduced through technology.
But if we can bring down, give people the toolkits to handle the uncertainty, to control their physiology at will, and we there's hundreds of ways of doing that. We know from neuroscience, psychology,
and anthropology,
and then people are going to be less vulnerable to all those things, to those bad actors.
Absolutely.
And right now we're seeing big political swings, conspiracy theories going up because people are desperate for certainty. They're desperate for something, even if it's a long shot. It gives them some certainty, and so I think part of those kind of frameworks are delivering tools at scale that can help people. And I sometimes talk about, like, most of us brush our teeth twice a day, let's say, some people more, and to think about habits we can build into our everyday that, exposing ourselves to uncertainty, doing cognitive reframing to think about it differently.
Critical thinking, memory, judgment.
Yeah, or just, box breathing, very simple things to an emotional awareness, which is part of emotional intelligence. So people start to realize when they are getting, stressed and triggered, then they can just take a moment to do some breathing or do something to bring that down. And to not think about it as this as a woo-woo thing or something that's on a fringe. It needs to be just part,
Or a self-indulgent thing.
Yeah,
right?
Well,
we think it's
like brushing your teeth.
Yeah,
it needs
absolutely.
to be like a part of an everyday routine, I think, for the next decade or so.
Symbols, structures and practices, habits, rituals. We need to really invest in these things. That's what I keep coming back to. But I would argue it's not just about providing scale, access at scale. It's also about providing depth.
In the last couple of months, a few articles have been published in peer-reviewed publications, but they're all based on data that was collected in 2024. And AI has changed so much since then. We really actually need to spend a lot of time working out what is going on. So everyone collecting information, like, how are people using it? Asking your neighbours, like asking your kids, talking about it at schools, but also providing those mechanisms so that we can get good quality data out to people and to clinicians, to healthcare professionals, etc., much more rapidly, so that we know what's going on. Because there is a lot of speculation, there is a lot of assumptions being made, but we need to know what's going on. And what we'll find is that there, as you say, it's like a huge array of experiences that people are having. It's kind of like, when you see someone else's, Instagram feed or Facebook feed. I was actually looking at over the shoulder. I love to look over the shoulder what people are doing on the train. This guy was looking at his Facebook feed. Looks completely different to anyone else's Facebook feed, right? Completely different. And I feel like that's what people's experience with AI is, depending on where they are, where their power is, where the privilege is, all of those kinds of things. We need to understand that plurality.
Does this, Monty, give us a sense of, or an inability to actually have a shared sense of reality when all of our feeds, when our interaction, very private interaction with these models is so personal? It's so individual. What happens with our ability to make sense of the world together?
Again, this idea of sense making is a term that I'm an existential phenomenologist, right? So I'm kind of down the idea of sense making.
An existential phenomenologist. I mean, let's just pause there for a second. Like, what on earth does that mean? Tell us, what does that mean? What is an existential phenomenologist?
Blow your mind, hey?
Tell the people listening what an existential phenomenologist is.
So inspired.
I've waited my whole life for
I've waited my whole life for this, right?
Hoping someone would ask.
And they never do. Thank you. Existential phenomenology is, existentialism. How do we make sense of our existence through interactions, through, asking the question is itself the meaningful process. And phenomenology is a lived experience. So how do we make sense of our existence, not just through cognitive, intellectual, theoretical means, but through a deeply embodied means? And so, this idea of sense making for me is a specific method of being able to look at the objective, subjective, the social, and the embodied forms of information that exist in a space. And how can we actually access those data points? And again, look, I do revert to Indigenous ways of knowing, this idea that we enter the mess. And in entering the mess, what happens is we stir up the availability of objective, subjective, social and embodied data forms. Through the ethnographic method, we are able to recognise and analyse patterns, and then we join the dots in order to create a story.
I think it's very important that we keep anchoring this into the real lives of real people, because it can get into very theoretical and conceptual language and terminology quite quickly. So I just want to check us all on that.
The ethnographic method is a deeply embodied one. That's why we live in the field. Like, I lived with a spiritual healer for 18 months, a black magician, some people call him a spellcaster. And I only scratched the surface of, the deep cosmology of being of that particular community and how they make sense of the world, right? By being there, my dispositions and my body was shaped to the field, to the habitus of that field, and enabled me to process information that was impossible to process if I'd read it out of a book or I'd just visited for one day, right? It's a deeply embodied sense of place. And so when it comes to this idea of sense making, it is deeply connected to being, connection, interaction. And so I think what we need to do is to see the opportunities where people are already doing that, because they are. Because people are coming to me because they are feeling that sense of alienation, that feeling of dispossession, that feeling of confusion. And call me a cockeyed optimist, but I believe in the inherent goodness of people. I believe that people crave that connection. That's why they're being drawn to Claude and those AI tools. And I, as much as I see the examples of young people who are drawn to that, I see people who are drawn to each other.
Maia, is a shared understanding, a shared sense of reality a technical problem in these models that we need to design our way through, or is it a human one we need to reconnect to?
Yeah, that is a great question, because I do think that if you ask that of a product designer, they will say anything that you can come up with that is a flaw in our product, we can design our way to a product that can address that. We can get there. And I think it is the wrong way to look at it. It's not the shared reality that we get to, it's the process of engagement and doing that together. And so a shared reality, it's kind of, I'm a constructivist. I probably shouldn't say that. It's like saying I'm an existential phenomenologist. But as in...
We're throwing a whole lot of words around here today.
But basically, I think that we... And Joel, you'll have things to say about this as well from a neuroscience perspective. We encounter the world through our senses, and we encounter the world through what we get back from the people around us, and whether that's pheromones or touch, warmth, all of those the embodied world is so incredibly important, and that's what creates our shared experience, I'll say that rather than reality. And so that is we can't replace that. And it's not a goal, it's a journey. And I think that's what we need to realise. We're focused so much on things like productivity or achieving X or, those kinds of things, less on how do we maintain this homeostasis of being together. How do we maintain the relationships? So getting that we've got an improvement mentality when maybe we should have a little bit of a maintenance mentality.
Joel, the way that this conversation orients, does this obfuscate the responsibility of these tech companies?
It's always pretty much always been the case that the best way to have a huge margin in the business is to take advantage or tap into one of the human vices. And there's all the classics, the addictive things, the drugs, the sex, all the cognitive biases. There's hundreds of cognitive biases. And so you can manipulate people very easily. And any products that tap into any of those things, whether it be drugs and alcohol or highly processed food, which is amazingly palatable but doesn't fill you up, or the intimate rewards and all the dynamics of social media or AI, like if you can tap into those things, people will use those products and you can have a bigger margin. And so there's a whole design principle around that. So yes, I think we need to push back on to these companies to think about having a more human design around these things. But at the same time, the business and political environment that all this is happening in is that there's race from the very top to the bottom. Everyone's racing and competing, and there's the China versus the US and the open access models in China and the frontier models in the US and how they're competing and the different political veils on those, right through to the competition between, that I feel like I have to use AI to stay ahead, and so do the students that I'm teaching. And so it's this weird mix of, how do you balance all these things? And so you can work on the product side, but we also need to work on the human side. I guess that's where the work I'm doing and others are doing. Sort of how do you prepare people with this? How do you build tools that can make them more resilient and somewhat proof them to some of those aspects of those things? Some of those cognitive biases can be used for really good things, and they have been lots of times in lots of different products and services. If you leave an algorithm to figure it out, it's going to figure that out pretty quickly. We're pretty much an open book to an AI. It's going to reverse engineer which things keep us on a platform for longer, or which things make us do this or that, or which things will make us more likely to go up a tier and pay more money, whatever it is. If no one's looking out for humans in all of this, then we need to do that. We need to step up and focus on the design, product, company side and the human side, getting humans ready for this and building the toolkits and frameworks to help everyone manage their way through this.
Mm.
What does a healthy relationship with this tech look like when you think about it, as Jo's painted the picture of, at a personal level, family level, maybe societal level as well? And then Monty, I'd love you to respond to the same prompt.
Yeah, I do think about this a lot because, like everyone around here, I also use AI, and, I've experienced those moments where you feel like it's had some kind of insight that just sort of, just really makes you sit up and think, oh my God, how did it come up with that? There are a bunch of things that I do to kind of stop myself falling into that rabbit hole, as I see it, because basically we do see there's a lot of evidence that that a lot of people start using AI in a really practical and productive way. That's the way that I try to use it. But all it takes is like you're having an off day, and you mention that, or like there's something that turns the conversation personal and it's off and running. And then that's where people spiral out. So it's not necessarily people who turn to it because they want therapy or they want conversation, they want connection. They've started from that actually just using it as a school tool or a work tool. And then you see how things can kind of spiral. The kind of things that I do, so if I have one of those moments, I generally shut it down right then. So I just exit out and go and do something else. I also don't share my history with AI, so I don't want to tell it something in a moment of weakness and then 6 months later for them to say, is that because of this thing?
Your personal history.
Of your personal. Yeah. And then, because inevitably what happens is people say, I didn't tell it that. How did it know? Because you don't know what you said 6 months ago. These are, very, very long and detailed conversations that people are having. And if the AI has access to all of that context, things are going to feel pretty magical when they come back at you. So I think those are some of the ways that you can do it. Also, like ways that you prompt. So trying not to use first person, don't be personal, those kinds of things.
And there is an increasing conversation about, particularly for children, for adolescents who are in such sensitive development periods, the deep, dark rabbit holes that they can very quickly go down. And we've seen some big court cases being fought, particularly in the US, with some tragic outcomes of suicide cases, AI-induced psychosis cases. But then there's also the sort of subclinical impact, which is, the atrophy that Joel spoke of, the kind of delusional the inability to make sense of reality in person relationships with increasingly sort of delusional, sycophantic feedback loops that the models offer. So I think that is a conversation that is coming to the fore for parents in Australia. There are some of the politicians who have caught on to this who are now trying to open this conversation up as well. So it is something that I think we're going to hear a lot more about.
Let me jump in. There's one more practical thing on the end of that, just because it'll fit in with that, is that with all the frontier models, at least, you can go in and put things in the general instructions and say, please don't be don't be sycophantic, don't always agree with me, put my best interests, if it's 2 a.m. and I just try to talk to you, tell me to go to sleep, so you can put these general instructions which cover all the different, whether it's a verbal interaction or any project or chat, will overarch all of those. And I think everyone who's using it should put these general instructions in and to try and squash that sycophantic, that, don't try and keep the conversation going beyond where it needs to. And so I make sure I do that because I don't like the sycophantic thing. I don't want to hear how amazing I am or I'm solving quantum mechanics or something. I don't want to hear that. I want it to be realistic and, critical in feedback. So that's something everyone can do.
It's like at 10 p.m. when I know I need to go to bed, but I reach for the freezer to get some ice cream. It's like I need to train my freezer to actually lock the door and not let me in at that point in time.
It's the same. It's the same with social media, and it's another way that that companies are thinking about the human, very much thinking about the human, but they're thinking about the human as customer, etc. And it's the same when you're scrolling late at night, and the algorithm knows. To Joel's point, the algorithm knows you're more likely to buy things and certain types of things at that. So there's like this spike of online shopping at 10 or 11 o'clock at night. So, and then that gets exploited because that's how money is made.
Mont, what does a healthy relationship with this technology look like personally, within families, as a society?
Yeah, I think we need to have a shared reality. I think we need multiple realities to coexist. I don't think the goal is for a community of consensus, rather a community of inquiry. And so this is where those reflective skills, those critical thinking skills are so important. And I mean, speaking of my own family, look, I do a lot of work in mental health, suicide, addiction. The opposite to addiction is not sobriety, it's connection. What I do know in my family and the work that I do in the places that we have the privilege to go to is that when we provide opportunities for real human connection, everything else is a cheap facsimile. It just doesn't compare. So, supporting people not just with giving them the experience of it to show them what's possible, but in our schools actually making that an important thing to learn. I think the schools are very much designed around like a capitalist model of productivity, and why are we going to schools and what is the end goal of schools. And that's why they all come to me when they've left school, right? When in the businesses where we've got these incredible technical experts who don't know how to sit with the complex human and environmental terrain. And I think that's what we need to prioritise.
So a healthy relationship?
Healthy relationships with each other. And I think that also means a healthy relationship with conflict, with friction, with uncertainty. In our house, we are scrappers, right? So I could not imagine a relationship with someone that didn't fight with me. We fight for what we believe in. We speak our truth and we listen to each other. It doesn't always go well, but we love each other through that, not in spite of it.
Joel, healthy relationships with the technology.
Where I think I have 2 young kids, and where you really see it clear is when you go from telling a story to reading a book to, say, an audio book to a video of some sort to a branded, highly cut and edited short form video, then to some social, not that my kids do that, but across that spectrum, you can see a young person, their engagement, they want more, even just going from an audio book, say, to a video. The difference between a modern video and a video, like sometimes the only videos we'll show are either, David Attenborough animal documentaries or something like the Pink Panther, from 1950 or 60, these really old, where it's slower, the colours are just dimmer. But my point is that as you add more and more content in, even before you bring in the interactive addictiveness, it's more stimulating. They want more. You can see them they want more as you add in more stimulation, more interaction. So I think about it as a spectrum of those things, particularly when I talk to people about their kids and how to navigate that and when to introduce what. And because things are moving so quickly, I don't like saying you should use this model and that model, because by next month it's all different again. But just to think about it in that spectrum of stimulation and addiction, and when an adult or a young person just wants more and more. And in young people, it's very, it's hugely important because their brain is so flexible. When they get teen years, hormones are coming in, the frontal cortex is not fully developed till the mid-20s. Once you pass that age, things are different, and I'm less worried about the damage adults can do if they choose to do certain things. But with young people, I think it's just crucial to really think carefully about how to introduce AI or social media and do it in the least stimulating, the least addictive, the least rewarding. But at the same time, where we're seeing education going, I think we're going to have to figure out ways to introduce some form of AI into education at a pretty young age, and to do that in a very responsible way that is not giving them, crack cocaine to be addicted to. So, and then you can map that onto an adult. What would it look like? It would look like something that doesn't rob your critical thinking, something that doesn't rob your agency, something that you can use in a way that you very much want to, that you're not handing over the keys to your life to an algorithm, even though it feels great to do that, and to practice, metacognition of how you interact with these systems. And that's a word that's becoming more and more popular now. So it just means thinking or being aware of how you interact or how you think when you're using these things. So you don't want to be handing over everything. You want to, give yourself some time to think about these problems yourself before you immediately go to AI, or find problems that AI can't yet do for you that you're going to think about bigger, juicier problems. But either way, finding time and space to sit with the discomfort of having to think deeply about things and not just revert to the comfortable, easy way of just going straight to AI. I worry that I think we're going to go too much in that direction of outsourcing too much, and we're going to have to then course correct in the next couple of years, because we're going to see it's going to keep going that direction until things get really, really bad. And this is part of the issue, that things are moving so quickly that science can't keep up. And that's why we came up with this sort of new area we call neurofuturism, which is like trying to understand the future from the point of view of psychology and the brain, and make predictions, because we just don't have time to get the data, because by the time we get the data, it's already too late. In a similar way to economists now, they're just looking at the unemployment data and saying, no, it hasn't really gone up, it's all good, nothing to worry about. But if it jumps up to 10%, it's already way too late to do something about.
We don't have the lead indicators.
Yeah, and so that when things are exponential, the idea of noticing it and then doing something on time is just doesn't work anymore. So it's a lot of the economics and a lot of the old ways of doing things worked when there was time to react. But when things are in the vertical part of exponential, we're just going to be too late with everything. And so to try and preempt and see, if you can see, a meteor coming, and it's way out in space, you don't have to sit around and wait for the damage to happen when it hits. You can see it coming, or a tsunami. You can see these things way off, and you can make reasonable predictions. They're not going to be 100%, but to start planning and taking action before it arrives, because by the time we see it clearly in those numbers, it's way too late.
Can I add on adult use of AI and what looks healthy and lead indicators for kind of problems emerging? We're seeing more now, and you may have experienced it, that people are sort of sharing, they have such intense experiences in their conversations with AI that they share, 5,000 words or 50 pages of conversations that they've had with AI around with their friends and family, sort of to show how amazing it is. And it feels really kind of a little bit crazy when people send these around. And I think that's one of those kind of warning signs. That's an opportunity for us all to okay, what does it take for me to be a coach to someone who's been a bit AI pilled? What can I do? So I think, it's things like get on the phone with them, talk to them about their experience. What was so amazing about this? What really struck you about it? Have you explored how the AI is actually working and what it's actually doing? And just, use that as an opportunity to connect. And I think we're going to have to look out for one another in future.
For someone who's listening to this and this conversation, maybe inviting them to reflect on their own relationship with this technology, with the way they're using AI, what would you offer them to think about their use of technology while remaining themselves, remaining who they are?
I mean, I just think you need to have opportunities to find out who you are in order to maintain that or retain it. For my kids, I want them to travel. I want them to make mistakes. I want them to fall in love. I want them to have their heart broken. I want them to, to experience the stuff of life. And I think that, I know that I come from an incredibly privileged position where we can offer our kids that. But as parents, as people within the community, I wonder what can we do to support that more enriched, embodied connection with the world, try and resist that temptation to outsource and offload everything to something that is going to make it easy for us in the short term, but is actually going to make it much harder for us in the long term. That I think that sitting with the challenge of that is, in fact, incredibly rewarding. But I can only say that because I've got the gift of time and experience. So I don't necessarily have an answer to your question except to say that as humans, we have always muddled through disruption and conflict and change and challenge and uncertainty. And this is another opportunity for us to do that. And I can't wait to see how we hopefully rise to meet that moment.
Joel.
Be aware of how you're using technology. It's not fair to say don't use it because too many people, their livelihoods on the line, they need to engage in it in pretty heavy ways. Be aware of how it may be affecting them. Understand the positives and potential negatives. But then the overarching picture, I think, for all of us and families is to think about the quality of life and the bigger picture of the next few years, where things are going, and use that quality of life of friends and family and colleagues as a North Star. And so to just keep going back and touching base with that. And so if you're using it in a way that is harming the quality of your life or your kid's life, then make some changes. But keep going back to that sort of North Star quality of life and check in with that. Check how you're doing in terms of well-being, mental health, stresses at work, and just keep thinking about it. And you might need to sort of upgrade some of your daily habits and start thinking about new ways of, tools that were traditionally once upon a time maybe woo-woo or then more like clinical psychological treatment. But we're moving to this era of change and metamorphosis where they have to sort of become just everyday tools that we all just, and habits we use. So think about those and think about just to think about this stuff and not just go on autopilot and lean into the AI. Just think about how it's affecting, quality of life.
I love all of those. And so what I'm saying will be an amplification to that. So who I am is only ever in who I am in relation to others, just to echo your point. And so my number one tip for use of AI is don't use it on your own. Like use it with other people. So sit together and prompt together. I think that that if we can do that, we've got someone else there, we've got multiple other people there mediating this experience, and we're strengthening a connection with someone else. So just encourage people to do that.
Guys, thank you so much. What a rich, big, meandering, beautiful conversation, Maia, for reattuning us to the power of language and actually how language is such a big part of this connection we have with this technology, but also the architecture behind the models, how it works, what it's actually doing by design as a product. Joel, for the reminder of the change and the uncertainty that we struggle to adapt to and how okay that is, because it is something that we can all collectively feel. And Monty, for reminding us of the very deep ancient ways that we have always connected to each other and made meaning together, and actually that is inherently in our grasp, despite whatever this technology is doing in our lives. So Maia and Joel and Monty, thank you so very much for joining me.
Thank you.
Alive to This is the work of a small, dedicated team. Our host is Eleanor Gamble, production and post-production by Peter Kramer and The Milk Bar. Our producer is Rachel Fountain. Marketing is by Maddie Westbrook. Our executive producer is Joe Yeldum. You can find us at alivetothis.com, on YouTube and Instagram, and wherever you get your podcasts. Please join us in this timely conversation.